Many of you know, before coming here to Knox almost 2 years ago, Dave and I and our kids lived on the East Coast for about 10 years. And living on the East Coast, we lived far away from all of our family. Dave's family has always been here in Chicagoland until recently. My family was in Portland, Oregon. So being on the East Coast and some being in the middle and some being on the West meant we just spent a lot of time in airports and on airplanes. A lot of our vacation time was dedicated to flying out to visit our family. So for 10 plus years, we had the distinct pleasure of hauling our 3 kids probably 8 pounds of snacks and 24 little dollar store toys that didn't matter if they got lost, hauling all of that on and off of airplanes to get all of us from here to there and back again. For 10 years, our family flew a lot. And whenever we flew, I had a number of questions that would go through my mind as we got onto the plane. Questions like, are we going to arrive on time? Will we have a nice flight attendant? Will there be free food? And will my kids bother anyone or probably everyone on the rest of the plane? But most importantly, as I would prepare to fly myself and my family across the span of this entire country, I would always find myself wondering, who is our pilot? Who is our pilot, and can he or she get us to where we are going safely? There was a story in the news a couple of years ago, I probably shouldn't have read it, of a pilot who fell asleep at the wheel and accidentally overshot their destination by 100 miles. I did not want that pilot. So when I'm on my way into the plane, I always take a moment to sneak a little look into the cockpit to just make sure that the pilot is up to my standards. No bags under their eyes, no distracting games or apps on their phones, no fancy mixed drinks in their cup holder. Never in the middle of a flight do I want something to happen that would cause Dave and I to look at each other in terror and wonder, who's flying this thing? That's a question that nobody wants to ask, not on a bumpy flight, and certainly not in life. But when things get turbulent, when we feel like we are being tossed and turned about more than we are comfortable with, this is the question that we all ask. Who's flying this thing? Who's in control? And are we going to make it through okay? Today, as we continue in our series, Summer Stories, we're going to look at the story of a person named Daniel. And from Daniel, we're going to get a little bit of help. For when life gets crazy, when circumstances become turbulent, when we feel out of control and we start wondering who is flying this thing, we can look to Daniel for an answer. For the overall message of the story of Daniel is that in spite of circumstances, and in spite of present appearances that may look to the contrary, we have a pilot who is still in control. Our God is always in control. So we're going to dig in. We're actually going to look at the first chapter of Daniel before he goes to the lion's den. We're going to read bit by bit, kind of walk through the story, breaking it down as we go. So if you'd like to read along with me, it's kind of the latter part of the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 1. And we're going to start with verses 1 and 2. tells us, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave King Jehoiakim of Judah into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar, and he placed the vessel in the treasury of his gods. So we're just going to set a little context here to start. The story of Daniel overall is a story of a people in exile. It was the year 605 BC, while King Jehoiakim ruled over the kingdom of Judah. They were attacked by the Babylonian forces. Babylon, located in what is now modern-day Iraq, was the major world power of the day, ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar. After a long and bloody war, the Babylonians eventually defeated Judah, and in 586 BC, they destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Many of the people of Judah, those who were left alive anyhow, were taken captive. And as they were taken out of the city in chains, they watched as the Babylonians defiled their holy temple, stealing some of its most sacred artifacts before they burned the temple to the ground. The story of Daniel is a story of a people in exile. This is a story about a people who are confused, disoriented, and swept away in their grief, about mothers and fathers weeping and wailing for their missing children, about a nation who may never see their homeland again. This is a story about a people who had the bottom fall out from under them, and they ended up in Babylon. So what does that have to do with us? Well, while it is likely that none of us are in any danger of being carted off to a foreign country against our will, it is still true that all of us will eventually put in some of our own time in Babylon. You see, Babylon is the place where you find yourself when life does not go as you planned. It is the place you end up when the life you wanted, the life you dreamed of, the life you planned for somehow slips away, and you feel like you've been exiled to a foreign land, and you wonder if or when you will ever find your way home. Babylon is the place where you ask yourself if God knows, if God cares, if God can even hear your cries for help. It is in Babylon that we start asking ourselves, who's flying this thing? If that's you today, if you are in Babylon, it is my sincere hope that as we read this story together, you will discover that even in Babylon, God is still God, and God is still good. So let's read some more. Let's see how Daniel deals with being in Babylon. Continuing Daniel 1, starting back at verse 3. It says, "Then the king commanded his palace master Ashpenaz to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom and endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah." Pausing there again. So Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he's the king of Babylon. He had this plan to wipe out the Hebrew people. Those who he took to exile, he didn't kill them physically. What he did was much craftier than that. He killed them with kindness. See, what he did here is he gathered all the brightest and the best of the people of Judah, Daniel and his three friends being four of them. And Nebuchadnezzar gave them nothing but the best lodgings, the best food. They received the best education, all in hopes that they would forsake the world that they came from. What Nebuchadnezzar was doing here was genocide by assimilation. If we can make them exactly like us, then they'll forget who they were. So here's this kind of make or break moment for Daniel and his friends. They have a decision to make. Will they go along with Nebuchadnezzar's clean slate campaign, or would they go along with it? Would they forsake their heritage, their family, their God? I mean, they must have felt like God had forsaken them. So how easy would it have been to turn and do the same? If you can't beat them, join them. But that's not what Daniel did. And as we look at the rest of Daniel's story here in a moment, I want us to notice three things that got Daniel and his friends through that exile. And what got them through is they remembered who they were, they relied on God together, and they received God's power. So we're going to continue reading the story together. Verse 7 says, the palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. So the first thing I want us to notice that Daniel and his friends did while they were exiled in Babylon is they remembered who they were. See, one of the tools that Nebuchadnezzar used to uproot them from their identity in God was he gave them these new names. It's important to notice that their Jewish names actually each contained a name of God. Each one had a deeply spiritual meaning. Daniel means God is my judge. Mishael means who is like God. Hananiah, Jehovah is gracious. Azariah, Jehovah is my helper. Their very names were reminders of their heritage, and they were calls to each one of them to remain faithful to the Lord. But now, here in this strange pagan land, their names are changed. And the names they are given change from being a reference to the Hebrew God to the one true God, but now they are given these names that each contain a piece of the false gods of the ancient Babylonians, Aku and Nego. By giving Daniel and his friends these new names after the Babylonian gods, Nebuchadnezzar was trying to say that those who had been servants of the Jewish God were now going to be servants and worshipers of the gods of Babylon. This wasn't just an attempt to change what they were called. This was an attempt to change who they were, their very identity, their being, their sense of self. But it's important to note that Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, they remembered who they were. Nebuchadnezzar tried to change their names, but he could not change their hearts. And if you read through the rest of the book of Daniel, you'll notice that Daniel and his friends, they never, ever refer to themselves or one another by these new Babylonian names. And they do that because they remembered who they were, or perhaps more importantly, they remembered whose they were. No matter how bad things got in Babylon, Daniel and his friends remembered that they belonged to a God who is like no other. They belonged to the God of the universe, the only true God who judges all people's hearts. The God who was and is their helper in times of trouble, the God who is gracious to all. So let me ask you, when you are in Babylon, do you remember who you are? There are many names we might call ourselves when we find ourselves in Babylon today, names like worthless, hopeless, failure, loser. But my dear friends, we must not take these names. If we are going to make it through our own experiences of Babylon, we must remember who we are. We must remember whose we are. For we too belong to this God who is like no other. And this God has given us our true names: beloved Son, precious daughter, one who has been made in my image, one for whom I died. No matter what messages you are hearing in Babylon, my prayer is that, like Daniel and his friends, you would be able to remember who you truly are. But that's not all. Let's read on. We already remember, as we jump back in, that the king had assigned Daniel and his friends a daily ration of food and wine. And I want you to notice how they responded. Jumping back at verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion from the palace master. This palace master said to Daniel, 'I'm afraid of the Lord the king. He has appointed your food and drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your age, you would endanger my head with the king.' Then Daniel asked the guard, whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 'Please test your servant for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe.' So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. So Daniel and his friends, they remembered who they were. And second, they relied on God together. They resolved that they would not defile themselves with the royal rations of food and wine, and they asked that they be fed only with vegetables and water instead. Now, for years, this story has been used to teach children that they should be like Daniel and abstain from junk food and only eat vegetables, right? I believe, and Aaron mentioned it even last week, there is an entire VeggieTales episode where Larry and the cucumber are tempted by Nebuchadnezzar to eat a giant chocolate bunny. It's a good parenting tactic, not gonna lie, but that's not what this story is actually about. The story is not about the merits of eating one kind of food or another. The issue did not lay in the food itself, but where, or rather who, the food came from. See, in Daniel's world, food was symbolic of power. To eat the king's food was to accept the king's power and place oneself in a position of dependence on him. And that is the one thing that Daniel will not do. For Daniel knows that his life and his strength do not come from the rich foods from the king's table, but from God alone. Friends, when we are faced with challenges, we too are tempted to rely on things other than God. There are many temptations to which we might turn when our bodies and souls are hungry for nourishment. Some of us turn to substances, to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. Some of us turn to diversions, to sports or video games or endless Netflix binges that will distract us from an otherwise unpleasant reality. Some of us turn to self-destruction, behaviors like cutting or starving ourselves or abusing our bodies so that the pain that we feel on the outside might be visible, or inside might be visible on the outside. Let me say loud and clear, these are all food from the king's table. These are temptations, these are diversions over which we think we have control, only to discover it is the other way around. And in the blink of an eye, these things can and will gain control of us. Some may feel good for a while, and some are pure poison. but none will provide the life-sustaining nourishment we desperately need. Only when we turn to God and rely on God alone to provide for our needs will we ever find the satisfaction we are longing for. Jesus said, "I am the living water. I am the bread of life." If we can rely on God for our nourishment, if we can read God's word, spend time with God in worship and in prayer, like Daniel, we will make it through Babylon. But I want you to notice, Daniel does not seek to rely on God on his own. He gets his friends to join him. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they rely on God with Daniel. I guarantee you, he could not have done it without them. Some of you know I've shared in bits and pieces here and there that for me, going to seminary, those 3 years of preparing for ministry were ironically a rather difficult season of life for me. It's not uncommon that for a lot of seminary students, we find those years to be somewhat difficult emotionally, dry spiritually. It's true for a lot, and I was no exception. I was this born and bred West Coast girl, felt exiled in some way to the East Coast at that time, to New Jersey, of all places. And like Daniel, I had to learn a whole new language, was inundated with all this new literature, and I never really fully felt at home. Strange as it sounds, seminary for me was a bit of a Babylon experience. I was out of my element, and there were times where I wasn't sure I would make it through. But one of the things that kept me going was my community. A small handful of men and women who knew me and loved me well, who encouraged me, who prayed for me, who taught me how to rely on others when my own strength was not enough. If we're going to rely on God, we've got to do it together. It's true all the time, but especially in those times when we are in Babylon, in those difficult seasons of life. We need brothers and sisters of faith to listen to us, to pray for us, people with whom we can rely on God together. So Daniel and his friends, they remembered who they were, they relied on God together, and sure enough, they received God's power. And we'll see how as we finish up the story together, starting back at verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine, and they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. At the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. Among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. They remembered who they were. They relied on God together, and Daniel and his friends received God's power. They experienced firsthand the truth of this promise we have from the book of Romans. If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for us, who can be against us? Do you know what that means? That means that no matter what, God is going to win. It means that there is nothing, no hardship, no distress, no persecution, no famine, no nakedness, peril, or sword. Nothing in life or in death, nothing in heaven or in hell, nothing in our past and nothing in the future. Nothing will be able to separate us from the love, the provision, and the power of God. Daniel and his friends when they were in Babylon, they received God's power, and you can too. I'll close with a story how I've seen it firsthand. I've shared with you before from time to time, my mother suffers from bipolar disorder. And I tell you part of her story today with her full permission because she wants to allow God to use her story to help others. In a direct and amazing quote, as I was texting with her about it this week, she said, "The only way to redeem it is to use it for God's glory." So it is my sincere hope that God is glorified through her today. My mom, who was diagnosed in 1990, she managed her bipolar disorder with medical care and therapy for decades. But it was just a few years ago that the medication she was taking stopped working. And at that point, the doctors weren't giving her much hope of something else. So this situation that she was in left her and my dad with only pain and fear and questions for what the future might hold. In this moment, she and my dad were thrown quite forcibly into their own experience of Babylon. But they remembered who they were. My mom has always known that she is a beloved child of God. Even in her darkest moments, she has held on to that truth. They relied on God together. Over the years, Mom and Dad had put in the time and the effort to cultivate a trusted group of friends who faithfully bore each other's burdens. And so in this moment of crisis, Mom and Dad were able to call those friends together, to gather around them for a time of prayer. About 20 people gathered together around my mom one night, and they laid hands on her and they prayed for her. And in an email she wrote a few days later, she shared, "From the evening of our prayer gathering, I have experienced the longest period of stability, peace, evenness, and contentment that I have since being diagnosed and starting medications in 1990. I have never stopped thanking God for your prayers, for your wisdom, and your practical support. The road ahead is not going to be easy, but we have a shield about us, not making us immune to the shards of anxiety, pain, and burdens of our life together, but giving us the strength and the hope to endure." My mom still has bipolar disorder. She probably always will. So in some ways, she'll always be in Babylon, at least a little. But it is exactly there that my mom received God's power. In some ways, in ways she wouldn't have if she weren't there. So friends, when you are in Babylon, and I know some of you are there today, when a job is lost, when a trusted friend betrays, when the bills keep coming and the money runs out to pay, when the diagnosis is terminal, when a marriage hits the rocks, when a loved one dies, when fears seem bigger than faith, when it feels like the bottom has fallen out from under you and you're not sure who's flying this thing, take comfort in the story of Daniel. Remember who you are. Rely on God together, and you will receive his power. Amen.